On a recent video here on my YouTube channel, I got asked a question from a viewer and they said, just asking mate, would you trade your Nikon Z8 plus 180 to 600mm lens for a Sony A1 plus a 200 to 600mm lens? That is a very good question. Find out what my answer is next. So a Nikon Z8 plus a 180 to 600mm lens versus a Sony A1 with their Sony 200 to 600mm lens. Would I trade up a Z8 with a 180 to 600 for that other combo kit from Sony? Now, first of all, my answer is no. Now, there's quite a few reasons. I don't own a Z8. I'm not sure what that person asking the question knew or not, but I actually own a Nikon Z7. But still, that is a very good question. Even if I did, let's talk about a hypothetical, even if I did own a Nikon Z8, would I trade it for the Sony A1 with a 200 to 600? Now, those who have watched my channel for some time now, you will have known that I have tested and reviewed the Sony A1 before, and it is unreal. It's just such a good camera. But would I trade a Nikon Z8 with a 180 to 600mm for a Sony A1 with a 200 to 600? I wouldn't. But there are quite a few reasons why. Let's talk about some of those reasons. Firstly, when I was looking at that Sony A1, the one singular thing I didn't really like about it was the ergonomics. It's just, I couldn't get my hand comfortable on it. It was just too small. My two bottom fingers were always going underneath. And after I'd used it for some time, I was going like this. I was shaking out cramps in my hand. You know, when you play too many video games, you know, the old video games with a console. So yeah, that would be one of the main things, because I know for a fact the Z8, even though I don't own a Z8 yet, I know for a fact it'd be a lot more comfortable in the hands compared to the A1, because the Z8 is not too dissimilar to, say, the Nikon D850, which I have right here. Now, I absolutely love, I think this camera has the best ergonomics of any camera I've ever held in my hand. It just feels so comfortable. The Nikon Z8 is very similar in shape and size to the D850. So I have no doubt, having a Nikon Z8 in my hand all day, I could do it, no problem. I mean, you're lugging around gear that's heavy. The very last thing you want is like pains in your hands on top of sore muscles. Now, the second reason why I wouldn't trade up is because the Nikon Z8 has a better LCD screen on the back compared to the Sony A1. Well, at least I think so anyway. I thought the Sony A1 with the rear screen was a bit old in style. It was one of those tilt screens. See, with the Nikon Z8, if I need to turn it up and get a portrait shot low angle, you can actually flip it. It doesn't have a flippy screen that goes right round, but you can flip that rear screen up enough that you can see it and you can shoot in portrait mode in lower angles. Third reason why I wouldn't trade up is because with the Nikon Z8, it shoots 20 frames per second in RAW. It also shoots 4K 120 frames per second. The Sony A1, it shoots up to 30 frames per second in RAW. It also has 4K 120 frames per second. It also has 8K. The Z8 has 8K. I would never use 8K videos. It's just too big of a format for my computer system to handle, firstly. Secondly, I really love having that 4K 120. Both cameras do that. Now, even though the Sony A1 can shoot faster, I found when I had the Sony A1 shooting at 30 frames per second, I was filling that Type A memory card so quickly. It was just ridiculous. And I got to a point where I don't even need 30 frames per second. This is nuts. So I turned it back to 20 frames per second. I found that more than enough. So the fact that the Nikon Z8 can shoot 20 frames per second RAW, and I think it's like something like 120 frames per second, but it's in JPEG or something like that. 20 frames per second when you're doing birds and wildlife would be more than enough. Another reason why is because Nikon have just released that firmware update, that 2.0 version for the Nikon Z8, and it now gives it the ability to have that pre-capture. In other words, if you fire off with a shutter and you might have just missed that bird taking off, it will go back, say, you know, half a second or so, and it will get those frames just before that bird takes off. Whereas the Sony A1, it won't do that. When it comes to the lenses, the Nikon Z 180 to 600mm versus the Sony 200 to 600, I think they're pretty much on par in terms of sharpness. The thing I love about the Nikon Z 180 to 600mm lens, at 180 you've got a very short focus distance, whereas with the Sony 200 to 600 you don't get that. So the fact that both the lenses are pretty much on par in terms of sharpness, it really wouldn't give me enough motivation to switch over from the Nikon combo over to the Sony combo. Now, I'm not here to start a rumble with Sony versus Nikon or anything like that. I think both brands have fantastic cameras. In fact, I think Sony has some much better cameras than what the Nikon range has at the moment in terms of Z mount. Like Sony, for example, have a fantastic lineup of APS-C cameras. We are still waiting for Nikon to give us a decent semi-pro or pro level APS-C camera. I mean, they've got the Z30 at the moment, they've got the Z50 and the ZFC. Whereas Sony have things like the A6400, the A6600, and the recently released A6700. Now, the focusing in those cameras is phenomenal. And when you team up one of those cameras with, say, the 200 to 600, you get a little bit of extra reach because of the crop factor. I'm still waiting, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are still waiting for Nikon to give us a good APS-C camera that has some sort of focusing ability in it, very similar to, say, the ZF or the Z8 or the Z9. I think the Nikon Z8 is more diverse in terms of the type of photography you can do with it compared to the Sony A1. Look, I really love that Sony A1, but I really think it's a dedicated sports or bird and wildlife camera. For example, when you look at the baseline ISO on the Nikon Z8, it goes all the way down to ISO 64, whereas with the Sony A1, it'll only go down to 100. Being a landscape and bird and wildlife photographer, when I'm doing landscape, I much prefer to have that Z8 where I've got an ISO of 64 so I can get greater dynamic range and with less noise. I always seem to get better dynamic range out of those NEF files. I'll tell you one thing to note, it'll be very interesting when we see what Canon do. I don't think Canon will have been sitting around on their hands while they're watching Nikon, release their Z8 and Z9s. They'll be planning something, I can tell you now. They'll have things coming out soon like the Canon R1 as well as the Canon R5 Mark II. And I'm sure those cameras will be something else. The thing is with the Nikon Z8, it may not be on par quite yet, even with that firmware update of the 2.0 as, say, the focusing of the Sony A1. But Nikon are continually updating the firmware for those cameras like the Z8 and Z9. So they're always improving those cameras. Those cameras have the X-Speed 7 processor in them. That means they can do so much with those cameras in terms of improving them. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Nikon even launch another new firmware version very soon for that Z8 and Z9 cameras to get even more out of them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would be the proud owner of both those combos. I would love a Z8 with this lens. I would also love a Sony A1 with a 200 to 600. So there you go, there is my answer. Would I trade up a Nikon Z8 with a 180 to 600mm lens for a Sony A1 with a Sony 200 to 600mm lens? The answer is no, I wouldn't. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. Never stop creating, and I'll see you next time.